The lasagna was still warm when my son slid the folder across the table, like he was closing a deal. "We had David draw this up," Daniel said. "It's just a formality, Mom, a trust for the house." I set down my fork. Vanessa reached over and refilled my water glass without asking. The way you top off a glass for someone you've already decided can't be trusted to do it herself. "What kind of trust?" I said. Not a question. I already knew the shape of it. I'd spent 34 years reading a room full of people who thought I couldn't see what they were doing. "The Franklin house on Cortlandt is lovely," Vanessa said, sliding a brochure next to my plate. "Glossy. A woman with silver hair laughing at nothing in a sunlit atrium. Assisted living, but really more like a community. Mom deserves to stop worrying about maintenance." My granddaughter, 8 years old, was drawing a horse on her napkin 2 feet away. She didn't look up. She'd heard enough dinners like this to know when to keep drawing. "I don't worry about maintenance," I said. "I fixed the boiler myself in October." "That's exactly the point," Daniel said, and he had the good grace to look almost embarrassed, which told me Vanessa had written the script and he was reading it badly. "You're 61. This house, it's worth something now with the rezoning. We just think it should be protected. For the family." For the family? I'd heard that phrase in 100 different mouths over 34 years, parents standing in my office doorway explaining why their child deserved a grade they hadn't earned. It always meant the same thing, for us. "How much do you think this house is worth?" I asked. Daniel glanced at Vanessa. "650, maybe 700. Astoria's changed, but it's still." "It closed a comp 2 doors down in September," I said. "Mixed-use zoning. Ask your realtor friend what a corner lot with air rights goes for now, Daniel." Something moved behind his eyes, the first real math he'd done all night. "The point is the same," Vanessa said, recovering fast. "You shouldn't be handling something this size alone. We already spoke to David about drafting the paperwork. All it needs is your signature transferring the deed into the trust. We can have it notarized by Friday." I looked at my granddaughter's napkin. She'd drawn a fence around the horse. "There's just one small problem," I said, and I could hear how calm my own voice was, the same voice I used the day I told a superintendent his numbers didn't add up. "That deed hasn't had my name alone on it since 2011. The room went very quiet. "What are you talking about?" Daniel said. "It's your house. You've lived there 30 years. I folded my napkin. "I'll show you Friday," I said. "Bring David, bring the folder, bring whatever you'd like." I did not tell them what Friday would actually show them. Some lessons, I learned a long time ago, land harder when the child finds the answer for himself. I spent 34 years as principal of PS 122, a squat brick building on 27th Street where the radiators clanked and the halls smelled like wax and orange peels. I started as a third-grade teacher in 1989, 24 years old, and I finished in an office with my name on a brass plate that I polished myself every Friday, because nobody else ever thought to. People assume a school principal spends her days signing forms. They don't see the rest of it: the budget spreadsheets at midnight, the parent who threatened to sue over a suspension, the 7-year-old who showed up in November wearing August's clothes. You learn to read a room the way a surgeon reads an X-ray. You learn which numbers are lies before anyone finishes the sentence. Frank used to say I ran that school like it owed me money. He wasn't wrong. He was a subway mechanic, 31 years with the MTA, hands that always smelled faintly of grease no matter how hard he scrubbed. We bought the house on 31st Avenue in 1988 for $187,000. A wreck, water damage in the kitchen, a landlord desperate to unload it. We gutted it ourselves on weekends. Frank built the back porch with his own hands the summer Daniel turned 6. He got sick in the spring of 2011. Pancreatic. The doctors gave him 8 months. He gave us 4 years because Frank never did anything the easy way. That spring, before the chemo really took hold of him, we sat at the kitchen table with a lawyer. Not the kind Daniel imagines, not some old man in a paneled office, but Grace Ackhaffer, 26 years old at the time, fresh out of Fordham Law. I'd had Grace in my building from kindergarten through 5th grade, a girl who came to school hungry more mornings than I want to remember, who I fed out of my own desk drawer for 2 years before anyone in the district called it a program. She became a real estate attorney specializing in land trusts. She never forgot the drawer. Frank and I restructured the deed that spring, not out of fear of dying, but out of fear of what might happen after. We placed the house into the Rosetta Community Land Trust, an organization I'd helped found in 2009 with 4 other Astoria families who didn't want their homes eaten by developers or, someday, by their own children's good intentions. Grace became co-trustee. It meant no sale, no transfer, no refinance, not one signature's worth, without her approval standing beside mine. I never told Daniel. There was never a reason to, until Friday made one. I still have the ring of keys to PS 122 in my kitchen drawer, 6 years after I retired. I don't know why I kept them. Maybe because a good administrator never really leaves the building. She just changes which one she's protecting. It hadn't started with the folder. It started in March, when Vanessa began, just stopping by on Tuesdays with grocery bags I hadn't asked for, rearranging my pantry while she talked about a woman from her book club whose mother had fallen down the stairs and lain there for 6 hours. She never looked at me when she told these stories. She looked at the stairs. It started in April, when Daniel began ending every phone call the same way. "You tell me if something felt off, right, Mom? Memory-wise." I taught 3rd grade for 6 years and identified early-stage dyslexia in 4 different children before their own parents noticed. I know exactly what my mind is doing at any given moment. What Daniel was really asking was whether I'd notice if he started making decisions for me. It started in June at my granddaughter's dance recital when Vanessa's mother, a woman I'd met twice, patted my hand and said, "It's so brave, downsizing at your age." I hadn't said one word to anyone about downsizing. By September, I understood I wasn't imagining a pattern. I was watching one get built, board by board, the same way you'd watch a fence go up around a yard that used to be open. I started keeping a small notebook in my kitchen drawer, next to the school keys, dates, phrases, the little declarative sentences people say when they've already decided something and are only waiting for you to catch up. We just think, for your own good. It's really more like a community. I didn't confront them. 34 years running a school teaches you that the person who reacts first usually loses the room. You wait. You watch which way the story is trying to bend, and you let it bend all the way, because a half-finished plan is easy to deny and a finished one is easy to prove. So when Daniel called in October to schedule a family dinner, nothing formal, I already knew roughly what was coming, the same way I used to know, from 3 doors down the hallway, exactly which classroom a fight had broken out in. What I hadn't expected was Grace's name on the notary's calendar for that same Friday, a coincidence, until I remembered there are no coincidences in a life built by 2 careful people. I'd asked Grace, back in August, quietly, to pull the current title search on the Cortland Avenue Franklin house, the one in Vanessa's glossy brochure. Not because I was moving there. Because I wanted to know exactly what kind of institution was pricing itself into my son's imagination, and who owned it. The answer sat in my notebook, next to Friday's date, circled twice. Vanessa's brochure wasn't just a brochure, it was a business card. I called Grace Wednesday night. "The Franklin house," she said. "You're going to want to sit down," pulled the corporate filings that afternoon. The Franklin house on Cortland, the community in Vanessa's brochure, was owned by a holding company called Meridian Cortland LLC. Meridian Cortland LLC had exactly 1 managing member, Robert Delgado, Vanessa's stepfather, a man who'd made 2 failed runs at assisted living developments in New Jersey before this one. The facility had opened 11 months ago at 40% occupancy. It needed residents the way a classroom needs chairs filled, because empty seats don't pay the mortgage. "There's more," Grace said. "I checked the sale comps you asked about. A 4-family 2 doors from you closed in September for $940,000. Corner lot, air rights included, same zoning as yours. Your house isn't worth $650,000. It's worth north of $1,100,000, conservatively, once you factor the lot depth." I wrote both numbers in my notebook. $940,000, $1,100,000. Beside them, the number I already knew, Meridian Cortland's move-in package, quoted at $8,200 a month, plus a one-time community fee of $14,500, non-refundable, buried in 9-point font on page 11. Daniel wasn't cruel. I want to be precise about that because precision was my whole career. Daniel was tired and frightened of the wrong things and married to a woman whose stepfather had found, in my house, the exact shape of a solution to his own occupancy problem. Vanessa hadn't invented concern for me. She'd inherited a spreadsheet and dressed it in language about safety. "What do you want to do?" Grace asked. I thought about the third graders I used to walk down to the cafeteria, single file, hands to themselves. You didn't discipline a child by matching their volume. You lowered yours until the room had no choice but to lower with it. "I want Friday to happen exactly the way they planned it," I said. "I just want you sitting where David is expecting an empty chair." Grace laughed, short and surprised. "You've been planning this since August." "I've been planning this since 2011, I said. August was just when I noticed I might need it. I hung up and sat a long time at the kitchen table, in the chair Frank used to sit in, running my thumb along a water stain in the wood that neither of us had ever bothered to sand out. Some things you keep because fixing them would erase the proof that a life happened here. Friday was 3 days away. I put on a pot of coffee, I didn't drink, and started making a list of exactly what I intended to say. And in what order, so that nothing I felt would show before I meant it to. Friday came cold and bright. Daniel arrived at 6 with David Kessler, the family lawyer, a heavy-set man in a coat too warm for the weather who kept glancing at his phone like the meeting had a scheduled end time. Vanessa came 10 minutes later carrying a bakery box she never opened. Grace was already at my kitchen table when they walked in. I watched Vanessa's face do the arithmetic, a black woman in a tailored blazer, a leather folio, sitting in the seat Vanessa had clearly expected to occupy herself. "This is Grace Ockhafer," I said. "My attorney and co-trustee." "Co-trustee of what?" David asked, already reaching for his own folder, the one with the paperwork meant to move my deed into a trust I'd never asked for. "The Rosetta Community Land Trust," Grace said, and slid a single document across the table, not thick, not dramatic, just 1 page. "This house has belonged to that trust since June of 2011. Ruth and I are the only 2 signatories authorized to transfer, sell, or encumber the property. There is no version of today's paperwork that touches this deed. There never was." David read it twice. I watched the color leave his face the way it does when a lawyer realizes he's been handed a document that outranks the one in his own bag. That can't be right," Daniel said. "Mom, you never said, you never asked," I said. "You told me what you'd already decided and asked me to sign it." Vanessa recovered faster than her husband. "This doesn't change that you're alone in a house that's too much for you. The Franklin house has a beautiful. The Franklin house is 40% full," I said, "because it's owned by Meridian Cortland LLC, whose sole managing member is your stepfather, Robert. It needs residence the way your dinner tonight needed my signature. I'm not confused about my memory, Vanessa. I was confused, for exactly one dinner, about whose good this was really for." The kitchen went the particular kind of silent I remembered from the day I told a superintendent his enrollment numbers didn't reconcile. The silence of people doing math they hadn't wanted to do. Daniel's face had gone from confusion to something rower. "Robert owns it. Vanessa, did you know that?" She didn't answer him. That, more than anything I'd said, told him what he needed to know. I let the quiet sit exactly as long as it needed to. David gathered his folder without being asked twice, muttered something about reviewing the family's options, and left without shaking anyone's hand. I didn't blame him. He'd been hired to execute a plan built on a premise that had just collapsed under him. Vanessa stayed seated, arms crossed, jaw tight. "You humiliated us," she said, "in front of our own lawyer." "No," I said. "You brought a stranger into my kitchen to take my house. I simply showed him whose kitchen it was." Daniel hadn't moved. He was staring at the single page of Grace's document like it might reorganize itself if he looked hard enough. 11 years, he finally said. "You and Dad set this up 11 years ago, and you never told me." "Your father was dying," I said, and for the first time all night my voice wasn't perfectly level. "We weren't protecting the house from you, Daniel. We were protecting it from a version of grief that makes people do desperate things with property. We didn't know then it would end up protecting it from you specifically. That part, I'm sorry for." He looked up at that. It was the first true thing either of us had said all night that wasn't a fact or a figure. "Robert's been asking Vanessa for money for 2 years, he said quietly, like he was admitting it to himself as much as to me. "The facility's been bleeding cash since it opened. I didn't put it together. I just knew we needed you settled somewhere safe, and Vanessa had this place, and it made sense. It made sense to you, I said, because you were frightened, and frightened people accept the first safe-sounding answer offered to them. That's not a character flaw, Daniel. It's just something I'd have caught in 30 seconds if it had been anyone else's family sitting in my office. Vanessa stood abruptly. I'm not going to sit here and be diagnosed by a retired schoolteacher. Principal, I said mildly. 34 years. I diagnosed exactly this. A family under financial pressure dressing it up as concern for someone weaker, probably 40 times, sitting across a desk from a parent instead of a son. I always hoped I'd never need the skill at my own table. She left without Daniel. He stayed, sitting very still in his father's old chair, running his thumb along the same water stain I always did. What happens now? He asked. Now, I said, we figure out what's actually true instead of what's convenient. I told him everything. The trust, Grace, the title search, the $1,100,000 valuation, Meridian Cortland's occupancy numbers, the $14,500 community fee buried on page 11. I opened my notebook on the table between us. 6 months of dates and quiet phrases, the fence I'd watched them build board by board without ever naming it a fence out loud. Daniel read every page. When he finished, he didn't reach for an excuse. I owe you an apology I don't know how to make big enough, he said. Then don't make it big, I said. Make it useful. Ask before you decide. Come on a Tuesday because you want to see me, not because Vanessa needs to check the stairs. He nodded slowly, and for a moment he looked exactly like he did at 6 years old, standing on the back porch Frank built, waiting to be told whether he'd done something wrong. What about Vanessa? He said. Robert. That's not my house to fix, I said. But I'll tell you what I told 40 different parents over 34 years. You can love someone and still refuse to sign what they hand you. Those aren't opposites. He left near midnight, hugging me at the door longer than he had in years. Grace stayed another hour, and we sat where Frank used to sit, going through the actual numbers, not the ones Vanessa had rehearsed, but the real ones, the ones that had always belonged to this house and this trust and nobody else. Before she left, Grace mentioned something I hadn't expected. The Rosetta Trust's board was quietly voting next month on a scholarship fund for graduating seniors from PS 122's old district, seated, in part, by the appreciation on properties like mine that had chosen the trust over the market. My name had come up, unprompted, as the fund's first namesake. I told her I'd think about it. I already knew I'd say yes. Daniel came back the following Tuesday, no folder, no lawyer, just a box of the good coffee Frank used to buy on Ditmars Boulevard. He fixed the porch railing that had been loose since spring. He didn't ask once whether I was managing. He just handed me a mug and sat down in his father's chair like it had always been waiting for him to earn it back. Vanessa I haven't seen since. Some doors close themselves once you finally stop holding them open out of habit. I kept the school keys in the kitchen drawer. I added Grace's document beside them, not locked away, just there, the way you keep proof of the fences you built on purpose, not the ones that got built around you. The house is still mine, it always was.